China is a sleeping giant. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will move the world. Napoleon was correct. The dominance of the West has been, for the most part, an anomaly of world history. It looks like the center of gravity is shifting away from Europe and North America back to where it once was, Asia. China as a civilization far predates the modern state of the People's Republic of China. For China was one of the only 7 places on Earth where complex societies emerged independently. This all started with the Yellow River civilization, home to some of the best farming land on Earth, which could sustain massive populations. Many wonder why China, as well as India, always rank as the most heavily populated areas on Earth. And the answer for that largely rests on the proximity to the Himalayan mountains, which formed when the Eurasian plate clashed with the Indian plate. These snow-capped mountains and glaciers fed large rivers and deposited silt and rich minerals to flat lands below. It was in these flat lands that rice could be cultivated, which is a reliable source that is high in calories. Rice farming is also highly labor-intensive, which may partially explain the regional work ethic. Let's go back to the country's geography. The flat land with nutrient-rich soil and navigable rivers like the Yellow and Yangtze Rivers became the heartland for the ethnic Han Chinese, the largest ethnic group on Earth. To the south lies a subtropical and mountainous area covered in dense rainforest, which acts somewhat as a protective barrier from what is now Vietnam. North of the heartland lies Manchuria, which has a different ethnic makeup, made up historically of native Manchus and Koreans, among others. Although Han Chinese make up the majority of people there today. It's worth noting that Manchuria is an exonym, meaning the name is described by outsiders. Despite its common use in the West, some Chinese people even find the term offensive, since the name oftentimes has ties with Japanese imperialism. It won't be a surprise that this area is one of the most vulnerable to outside invasions due to its lack of natural barriers. Moving to the southwest of Manchuria lies Inner Mongolia, home to more ethnic Mongolians than the actual nation of Mongolia itself. This area is much more arid than the heartland, and throughout much of Chinese history was at best a nuance and at worst an existential threat, given the Mongolian invasions. This is why the Great Wall exists. Granted, it wasn't very effective. Despite the wall being built, it wasn't until the use of gunpowder in warfare that the equestrian steppe cultures and their armies would be subjugated by various empires, including the Chinese. Further west is Xizang, which I'm mispronouncing. This is an autonomous region with a large minority population of ethnic Uyghurs, or a Turkic-speaking people who practice Islam. This area is also rich in natural gas and has close ties to Central Asia. This has become one of the most politically tense subregions and has a large separatist movement, having sprung up, and the Chinese government has responded by moving more ethnic Han Chinese into the region to suppress Uyghur culture, sometimes with the use of concentration camps. Another contentious region is Tibet to the south, an extremely mountainous and sparsely populated area. This region was taken over by the People's Republic of China in 1950, leading to the exile of the Dalai Lama to India. The People's Republic of China continued to move more ethnic Han Chinese into the region to suppress Tibetan culture and suppress local dissidents. Given the area's proximity to India, a major regional rival, it's unlikely that China will ever let Tibet become independent in the foreseeable future. China's geography has had a profound impact on the way the nation sees its place in the world. While it's impossible to encapsulate the views of over 1 billion people, there are some recurring themes in Chinese culture that we can pinpoint to. For one, China is somewhat physically isolated. Being on one corner of the Eurasian landmass, it is separated to the east by the Pacific, to the south by mountainous tropical rainforests, to the north by desert and steppe, and to the southeast by the Himalayan mountains. Access points through the Silk Road and Manchuria are the exceptions rather than the rule. This has led to a somewhat isolationist attitude. Throughout much of ancient history to today, China is one of the most culturally isolated areas on the planet. Most affairs of the Middle Kingdom have been confined to the areas smaller than that of modern-day People's Republic of China. This has proven to be both a blessing and a curse. China's isolationist attitudes have helped prevent the nation from engaging in overly aggressive expansionism when compared to empires of other parts of the world, such as Rome. While China has been no stranger to war, it has yet to embark in grand territorial conquest or colonies overseas. This lack of colonialism and expansion has been a blessing since it didn't lead to the overextension of imperial force that you saw in Europe and the Middle East. However, there is an element of ethnocentrism that runs deep into Chinese politics and culture. Mao called this Han chauvinism. The term originally referred to bigotry towards non-Han Chinese minorities in China, but has been broadly referred to Chinese-centric views of the world itself. After all, for large portions of its history, China was the world's foremost political, economic, cultural, and technological superpower. And many Chinese view the dominance of the West for the past 500 years as a blip or an anomaly in world history. To better understand this, we must briefly look into Chinese history. China has been ruled by several dynasties under the mandate of heaven. Good rulers would bring about good results, thus extending the dynasty's rule. But if shit hits the fan, that means that the dynasty has lost the mandate of the heaven, and therefore it's time for a change. China became an empire under the Qin Dynasty, and became a major economic trading partner under the Han Dynasty through the Silk Road. This is by far China's most famous form of contact with the outside world, and it's widely known for spreading paper, gunpowder, and the plague to the rest of the planet through these trading methods. For the sake of not making this video a few weeks long, I'm going to skip over much of classical and medieval Chinese dynasties and focus a bit on the last one, known as the Qing. By the way, I'm still mispronouncing almost everything. While this period of Chinese history had engaged in large-scale trade routes throughout the Indian Ocean, their policies started to become more and more insular. After all, many throughout China thought that their country or their empire was the center of the world. What would they need to learn from inferior cultures? The Qing Dynasty doubled down on this, cutting trade and cultural exchange. This led to a lack of access to technological advances, social programs, and ideologies from abroad. It turns out that cultural appropriation is a really good thing. Even gunpowder, a Chinese invention, was first effectively applied to handheld firearms by Europeans. By this point, China was falling behind. European powers, many of whom the Chinese regarded initially as inferior, started to flex their muscles. Britain, for example, had a large trade deficit with China. The Chinese insisted that there was nothing the Brits could offer that they wanted. Well, it turns out that a lot of Chinese wanted opium, so Britain engaged in 2 wars for drugs in order to close up this deficit. The Chinese were defeated and would sign a humiliating treaty to Britain, and would eventually hand over Hong Kong as a trading hub. Japan was coerced into opening up for trade by the United States, but unlike China, Japan quickly abandoned its isolationist policy, modernized in a rapid extent, and to some degree, westernized its government and military. Japan would eventually industrialize and manage to humiliate China in the First Sino-Japanese War. Anti-foreign sentiment in China was growing, leading to the Boxer Rebellion, which sought to rid China of foreign interference, attacking foreigners, Chinese Christians, and others. The Empress even declared war on Britain, France, Japan, Germany, the US, Italy, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. Do I really need to tell you that declaring war on almost all of the world's most powerful nations at once is idiotic? Well, the Boxer Rebellion was crushed, the capital was plundered, and the Boxers were pretty much bitch-slapped. Nothing motivates you to improve yourself more than getting your ass handed to you. As a result, the dynasty implemented administrative reforms, but this was not enough to catch up to the West, Russia, and Japan. One dude by the name of Sun Yat-sen, probably one of the most important historical figures you never have heard of, was a Christian and modern nationalist who spent much of his time in the West. He worked with military officials and was successful in overthrowing the entire Chinese dynastic system that had been in place since ancient times. Sun Yat-sen proved to be an effective and revered leader across the political spectrum, but the quasi-republic was short-lived after his death. The quasi-democratic order then turned into a dictatorship, but then broke down into smaller entities. At this point, the communists started to gain ground, which worried nationalists like Chiang Kai-shek, who executed many of them. This led to a conflict between the two factions until the Japanese invaded, in which the two teamed up together. And then they went back to fighting once the Japanese were defeated. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviets supported the communists and the Americans supported the nationalists. The communists won. They established the People's Republic of China in 1949, led by Chairman Mao, and the nationalists would flee to Taiwan, setting up the Republic of Taiwan, or the Republic of China. We'll get back to this a little later. The US and many of its allies, for a time being, would recognize Taiwan as the true China, and they supported a seat at the UN. For a while. Next door in Korea, the Japanese had been kicked out by the Americans to the south and the Soviets to the north. Each one of them left their own strongman in charge, one of them being Kim Il-sung, this guy's grandpappy. The North would invade the South. The US would rally countries at the UN to halt the North and push past the initial border. The Soviets would storm out of the UN, and the People's Republic of China would respond by sending human swarms into the Korean peninsula. This lasted in a stalemate that still exists to this day. Mao would also implement the Great Leap Forward, which sought to transform China from an economy based on agriculture to centralized industry. With many people moving from the farms to factories, and the inefficiencies of a centralized farming system, widespread famine broke out, the largest ever recorded. It was such a disaster that Mao eventually ceded much of his power to more practical leaders like Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatic politician who was educated in France. This guy pretty much becomes the most important figure of current Chinese politics. Mao would then return to reclaim power, and started the Cultural Revolution. This inspired young radicals to rise up against government officials, teachers, and even their parents. Countless artifacts were destroyed, non-Maoist ideologies were widely suppressed, and many opponents of the Mao cult of personality were imprisoned, publicly humiliated, and tortured. Moving on to foreign policy. Despite Mao's anti-American opinions, he eventually would break off relations with the Soviet Union, as he saw Khrushchev's administration as being not sufficiently Stalinist and communist. Mao did not appreciate the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union or Khrushchev's more conciliatory approach towards the capitalist West. The People's Republic of China under Mao was highly hostile to relations towards the United States and US allies like Taiwan, not to mention the fact that they supported anti-American forces in Vietnam. But during the 1970s, Mao began to cozy up to the United States to smite the Soviets, eventually inviting Nixon to China to establish formal relations. Mao would, as we all do, eventually die. Deng, remember him, would eventually take control afterwards. Unlike Mao, he was not a hardcore communist ideologue. He said that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white so long as it catches mice. Deng's plan was to slowly incorporate capitalist elements into the economy while still retaining the Communist Party's autocratic stance, a political and social hegemony. His policies opened up China to free trade and the standard of living drastically improved. He also implemented China's strict family planning policies to curb the excessive population growth. While not as brutal and autocratic as Mao, Deng did have his authoritarian impulses, and as he cracked down on the free expression and pro-democracy protests during the Tiananmen Square massacre. He also got Britain to hand back Hong Kong, which they did in 1997 under a one-country, two-systems approach. Under this system, the mainland of China would govern much of Hong Kong's defense, while Hong Kong itself and the former Portuguese-owned Macau would handle their own internal economic and social affairs. But there's kind of a catch to this, and we'll get back to it soon. And what do you know, we've arrived at the 21st century. And that is part 1 of our series on China's potential as a superpower.